Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Anne Boleyn. It's here, guys. Anne Boleyn week. It's the most requested of this line of podcasts because it's Anne Boleyn. So here we go. Anne Boleyn was the second of three surviving children of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard. She was born probably in 1501, the same year that 16-year-old Catherine of Aragon came to England to marry Prince Arthur. The dynamic of her parents' marriage was unusual. Think Jacquetta of Luxembourg and Sir Richard Woodville vibes. If you listen to Jacquetta's episode, you'll get that, and if you didn't, you should check it out. Jacquetta's pretty cool. Anne's father, Thomas, wasn't noble. He was gentry. His father was a knight. They were wealthy, but not noble. They were just allowed to fraternize with the nobles. Anne's great-grandfather had made his money as a hatter, maybe a mad hatter. If you needed a fancy hat made, he was your first stop, or at least he was your servant's first stop. The Boleyns were new money, but they were interested in using their money to raise their station, like many people had before them. Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, was noble. They could trace her family all the way back to Edward I. Her father was a duke, so a pretty high-level noble. He had been in power during the reign of the House of York kings, Edward IV and his brother Richard III. When the Tudors took over, he was attainted, stripped of his lands and titles, and imprisoned in the Tower of London for 9 years. But, left turn alert, he had the opportunity to escape, and he was all, nah bro, I'm good. Totes repentant. So the new head bitch in charge, King Henry VII, was like, this guy is loyal, and I'm in. And just like that, he was in with the new administration. But that had been a close call, so he would have to marry his daughter off to a loyal Tudor, just to kind of firm up his unspoken alliance. Elizabeth's mother, also named Elizabeth, had been lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, before her husband's imprisonment, and lady of the bedchamber to her daughter, also named Elizabeth, the first Tudor queen after his imprisonment. Elizabeth's everywhere. This may be why, when Anne had her first daughter, she was named Elizabeth. So the wealthy but not noble Thomas Boleyn was married to the noble family but reputation in tatters Elizabeth Howard. These are the parents of Anne Boleyn. She came by her social climbing honestly. Anne had an older sister, Mary, and a younger brother, George. Their mother, Elizabeth Howard, was one of Queen Catherine's ladies, both when she was married to Prince Arthur and when she was married to King Henry. So she would have known Margaret Plantagenet Pole, another lady-in-waiting to the Queen and relative of the King. She has an episode. Go check it out. Now, Anne's mother was said to be fairly pretty. Word on the street was that King Henry had an affair with Anne's mother and could be Anne Boleyn's father. But Anne was probably only about 10 years younger than Henry, and I don't think 10-year-old Henry was picking up married noble ladies, but that's just me. He also got around later in life, so a relationship with her mother could have started later. He was about 10 years older than Anne, though, making him only 11 years younger than her mother, and that was close enough for him. In 1509, King Henry VII died. The king is dead. Long live the king. 17-year-old Prince Henry was now King Henry VIII, and he was getting married to his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Anne Boleyn would have only been an 8-year-old little girl at this point. She wouldn't have been at most of the functions, but she was likely caught up in the excitement of the country. Anne's father, Thomas, was made the English ambassador to the Low Countries, or as we know it, the Netherlands. It was there that he became friendly with Margaret of Austria, who was so impressed with Thomas that she agreed to accept his 11-year-old daughter Anne as maid of honor or junior lady-in-waiting. Anne's early education was typical for women of her class. In 1513, she was invited to join the schoolroom of Margaret of Austria, the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, and her 4 wards. This was kind of European finishing school. It was a pretty elite position to get. Her academic education was limited to arithmetic, her family genealogy, grammar, history, reading, spelling, and writing. She also developed domestic skills, such as dancing, embroidery, good manners, household management, music, needlework, and singing. Anne learned to play games such as cards, chess, and dice. She was also taught archery, falconry, horseback riding, and hunting. Margaret affectionately called Anne La Petite Boleyn because she was younger than the other girls at only 12 when she arrived. Anne made a good impression in the Netherlands. With her manners and studiousness, Margaret reported that she was well-spoken and pleasant for her young age, and told Thomas that his daughter was so presentable and so pleasant, considering her youthful age, that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you to me. Anne stayed with Margaret from spring 1513 until her father arranged for her to attend Henry VIII's sister Mary, who was about to marry Louis XII of France in October 1514. So, about a year and a half. She had a fairly good education in European court traditions, and Mary was about to go to France to become their queen. Queen Mary was married at 18 to 52-year-old King Louis of France. That's quite the age difference. Anne and her sister Mary would have traveled with her to France for the wedding and to attend her afterwards. But Louis died just 3 months after the wedding because it was the 16th century and he was 52. And Mary was off back to England for her second marriage to a cute boy below her station, so good for her. If we cover the Queens of France, we will cover that story, but think Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor. In France, Anne was maid of honor to Queen Mary, and then to Mary's 15-year-old stepdaughter, Queen Claude, with whom she stayed for nearly 7 years. She liked French court. She didn't want to go home to England. In the Queen's household, she completed her study of French and developed interests in art, fashion, illuminated manuscripts, literature, music, poetry, and religious philosophy. She also acquired knowledge of French culture, dance, etiquette, literature, music, and poetry, and gained experience in flirtation and courtly love. Flirting in the 16th century, in France specifically, was seen as a very worthy pastime, with clever quips and chivalry. It was a fun game that they all played. Anne's education in France proved itself in later years, inspiring many new trends among the ladies and courtiers of England. A contemporary poem about Catherine of Aragon complimented Anne's passing excellent skill as a dancer. Here, he wrote, was a fresh young damsel that could trip and go. She was a good dancer. She was fun. During this time, there was a Renaissance man at French court. He could draw, and sometimes he drew inventions or ideas. He was a little out of the box, but he was interesting. We don't know for sure how much attention this older odd man got from the teenage Anne Boleyn. Maybe she didn't notice him at all. This man, though, was Leonardo da Vinci. Anne Boleyn could have easily been in the same room with Leonardo da Vinci. They were at the same court at the same time. Leonardo da Vinci died in France in 1519 at the age of 67 when Anne was 18. Anne was a teenager at French court with her older sister Mary. Mary was getting into trouble at this flirtatious French court. Mary was 20 and killed it at courtly love. She was an excellent flirt. King Francois of France was 25, married to Queen Claude, and expected to have a mistress. Like King Henry, now 28, he liked his wives ladies-in-waiting. She was not only the King of France's mistress, but she also had liaisons with a handful of his friends. French court was a little more sexually open than English court was. Thomas Boleyn called his eldest daughter back from France and married her to a minor noble who was friends with the English king. Henry VIII attended his friend's marriage to Mary Boleyn, and then decided to make his new friend's wife his own mistress. She had been the mistress of a king before, and the young king of France and the young king of England had a bit of a rivalry. So sharing a mistress was very on brand for them. Anne stayed in France and gained a mentor, the sister of the King of France, Marguerite. Marguerite was 9 years older than Anne, and she had a new interest, reforming the Catholic Church. Following the example set by her mother, Marguerite became the most influential woman in France during her lifetime, when her brother ascended to the crown as Francois I in 1515. Her salon, known as New Parnassus, became famous internationally. They talked about a lot of new ideas, and Protestantism had been thrown around as an option against the Catholic Church. This early education would have some pretty major consequences for both Anne and England in the future. The following year, King Henry and Queen Catherine went to France on a diplomatic mission. They went to the Field of Cloth of Gold, a summit between King Henry of England and King Francois of France. Each king tried to outshine the other, with dazzling tents and clothes, huge feasts, music, jousting, and games. The tents and costumes displayed so much cloth of gold, an expensive fabric woven with silk and gold thread, that the site of the meeting was named after it. The most elaborate arrangements were made for the accommodation of the two monarchs and their large retinues. And on Henry's part, especially, no efforts were spared to make a great impression in Europe with this meeting. This was around the time that King Henry decided that Mary Boleyn would definitely be his next mistress, maybe finding out that she had been mistress to the French king. In 1522, Anne was also recalled from France to marry her Irish cousin, James Butler, a young man several years older than she was, who was living at English court. The marriage was intended to settle a dispute over title and estates. The short version is that her dad and his dad were fighting over a title, and they settled it by agreeing to marry their children to each other. But the marriage negotiations came to a halt for unknown reasons. As the daughter of a courtier, Thomas Boleyn, by the new year in 1522, Anne had gained a position at the royal court as lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine with her sister Mary. Her public debut was at a court event called Chateau Vert, a pageant in honor of the imperial ambassadors. She played Perseverance. Foreshadowing? If you know much about Anne Boleyn, it's definitely foreshadowing. All wore gowns of white satin embroidered with gold thread. Suspend any feminist views you may hold temporarily, because the Renaissance was not about feminism. It was about flirting and damsels in distress being saved by their chivalric heroes. So, the premise of this play that she was in was that women named after positive feminine attributes like perseverance, beauty, honor, and kindness were being held captive by women named after negative feminine attributes like disdain, jealousy, and scorn. The young men, this time including the king himself, then entered with names of positive masculine attributes like loyalty, gentleness, and liberty. And there were no negative masculine attributes because they didn't want to pull on that thread. A battle, in air quotes, ensued, and the women threw rosewater at the men, who threw fruit at them. That hardly seems fair. Like, maybe throw some rosewater back. The men saved the good women, and then they danced, because why not? This is often portrayed as the moment when Henry fell in love with Anne. But he was sleeping with her sister at the time, so I don't know. She quickly established herself as one of the most stylish and accomplished women at the court, and soon a number of young men were competing for her. She was very popular in England. Warnickel writes that Anne was the perfect woman courtier. Her carriage was graceful, and her French clothes were pleasing and stylish. She danced with ease, had a pleasant singing voice, played the lute and several other musical instruments as well, and spoke French fluently. A remarkable, intelligent, quick-witted young noblewoman that first drew people into conversation with her and then amused and entertained them. In short, Her energy and vitality made her the center of attention in any social gathering. Anne was the life of the party. Anne reveled in the attention she received from her admirers. The Boleyn sisters were making quite a splash at English court. Both of them were ladies-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. Mary was also the mistress to Catherine's husband. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. King Henry had a type, and that type was his wife's ladies-in-waiting. Anne, during her sister's dalliance with the king, had a dalliance of her own. She was being courted by Henry Percy. He was a year younger than Anne, and the two were very close. Henry Percy was 20 and finishing his training in the service of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey found out about Anne and Percy's relationship. He told Percy to cut it off, or I'm going to tell your father. And then he did. Someone should have told Wolsey that snitches get stitches. But Henry Percy's father was an earl, and he was like, absolutely not. And Cardinal Wolsey agreed. Wolsey telling the younger Percy, I marvel not a little at thy peevish folly that thou would tangle and insure themselves with a foolish girl yonder in the court. I mean Anne Boleyn. Subtle, Wolsey. Subtle. I think everyone knew you were talking about Anne Boleyn before you straight up said it. Percy responded that he wouldn't deny or forsake Anne, and that he had gone so far before so many worthy witnesses that he knew not how to avoid himself, nor how to discharge his conscience. So they were in love, and they had made it fairly publicly known. In front of everyone knew it. Henry had already been betrothed as a child to someone else, and this was a business marriage, so it was a legal situation. Anne was sent from court to her family's countryside estates, but it's not known for how long. They needed her out of the way. Anne and Percy were in love, and they couldn't risk it. This is likely something that Anne would never forgive Wolsey for. Their later feud probably started at this very moment. Though at the time, Wolsey certainly wasn't feeling threatened by a girl who wasn't even noble. He was a cardinal. Percy was married off unhappily. Once Percy was married, they could trust Anne back at court. Upon her return to court, she again entered the service of Catherine of Aragon. Anne then befriended Sir Thomas Wyatt, one of the greatest poets of the Tudor period. In 1520, Wyatt was married, and in 1525, Wyatt charged his wife with adultery and separated from her. Coincidentally, historians believe that this was also the year when his interest in Anne intensified. He was likely in love with Anne. She may not have been, but they were friends. He wrote poetry about her, and she was at the very least his muse. The Boleyn siblings were very popular with the king. They were popular at court in general. They were fun to be around, especially Anne and her brother George. They were a dynamic duo. The pair were very close as siblings. During this time, Anne's sister Mary had 2 children. Because she had a husband and a boyfriend, their paternity is questionable. But her husband and her boyfriend were mates, and all 3 of them agreed that legally at least, her husband would be their father. Maybe he was. But they didn't have paternity tests then, and King Henry was ready to move on in any case. When Mary had her second baby, who she named Henry, likely after her boyfriend, the king decided that he was going to get a new mistress, Mary's sister, Anne. In 1526, Henry VIII became enamored of Anne and began his pursuit. Anne was a skillful player at the game of courtly love. This may have been how she caught the eye of Henry, who was also an experienced player. Anne resisted Henry's attempts to seduce her, refusing to become his mistress, and often leaving court for the seclusion of her family home of Hever Castle. Fun fact, you can stay at Hever Castle for £265 per night, or, if you're American, $321.29. Henry wrote love letters, and more love letters, and more love letters, with little hearts drawn on them. He was in love, or at least he thought he was. Henry even promised that if she would return to court, he would make her his official mistress in the French tradition. Anne was not up for being his mistress. Her sister had done that and then been discarded. For Anne, it was marriage or nothing. She was following in the footsteps of King Henry's grandmother, Elizabeth Woodville, and not settling for anything short of marriage. She regularly ignored the letters from the king. Anne wasn't acting very interested, but King Henry was used to being given what he wanted. He wasn't used to being told no. Despite her refusals, within a year, he proposed marriage to her, and she accepted. So she wasn't that opposed to it. Or he was the king, and she didn't feel like she could say no. He was still married to Queen Catherine, but both of them assumed an annulment could be obtained within months. The Pope tended to side with monarchs that wanted divorces. There is no evidence to suggest that they engaged in a sexual relationship until very shortly before their marriage, if at all before their marriage. That their love affair remained unconsummated for much of their 7-year courtship, because that annulment was not as easy to get as they had assumed it would be. Before Queen Catherine was married to King Henry, she had been married to King Henry's brother for a few months before he had died. They had jumped through all the legal hoops to get the Pope's permission to marry. They were legally married. But the Queen had only one daughter. Henry, who also wanted a son, saw that as proof that God did not want him married to the Queen. If God wanted them to be married, they would have had a son. Just to clarify, Henry wanted an annulment from Catherine because he thought she had slept with his brother, so that he could marry Anne, whose sister and maybe mother he slept with. What could go wrong? Anne started to be at the king's side, acting as the queen, but she wouldn't sleep with him until they were officially and legally married. King Henry seemed putty in her hands. King Henry's great search for an annulment would be called the King's Great Matter. If you said the King's Great Matter, everyone in England knew you meant his wife and mistress issues. If you have heard of the Protestant Reformation, that is where we are right now. Martin Luther had nailed his thesis to the German church doors less than 10 years before. Most of Europe was still Catholic, but Protestantism had made its way out of Germany and was starting to make appearances here and there. Anne had actually studied it a bit when she was in France. There are two schools of thought, but they both bring us to the same place. One is that Anne Boleyn was no longer a Catholic, that sometime since she had been in France, she had become a secret Protestant. At the time, Protestants were calling for European monarchs to stand against the abuses of the Catholic Church. Anne could have seen her potential relationship with the King of England as a way to further her religion's validity in England. The other is that Anne wasn't really Protestant. She was still Catholic. But she saw a way to convince the king to leave his wife if he left the Catholic Church. And then he could marry her. And that was Protestantism. That was the way to get what she wanted. We don't know which one of those it was. But what we do know is that Anne supplied King Henry with heretical material that told him that he didn't have to listen to the Pope. Just to be clear, this book was very, very illegal. She was like, hey, why don't you read this sneaky book that isn't legal to read? Because it's very clever. She pointed out to him that there is no Pope in the Bible. In the Bible, God spoke to kings himself. He was the king, and he should be the only one second to God. That the Pope was an unneeded middleman. She was appealing to his vanity. He didn't want to have to listen to the Pope. In my opinion, it was probably both. Anne protected men who were translating the Bible into English. In Catholic England, that was illegal. The Bible could only be in Latin. I don't think she would have done that unless she truly believed. And it was just an added bonus that would allow her boyfriend to get his divorce. In 1528, sweating sickness broke out, and it was aggressive. It began very suddenly, with a sense of apprehension, followed by cold shivers, sometimes very violent, dizziness, headache, and severe pains in the neck, shoulders, and limbs, with great exhaustion. The cold stage might last from half an hour to 3 hours, after which the hot and sweating stage began. The characteristic sweat broke out suddenly, without any obvious cause. A sense of heat, headache, delirium, rapid pulse, and intense thirst accompanied the sweat. Palpitation and pain in the heart were frequent symptoms. No skin eruptions were noted by observers. In the final stages, there was either general exhaustion and collapse or an irresistible urge to sleep, which was thought to be fatal if the patient were permitted to give way to it. They treated the sweating sickness by trying to stay awake until they were better. That was what they did. One attack did not produce immunity, and some people suffered several bouts before dying. The disease typically lasted through one full day before recovery or death took place. Transmission mostly remains a mystery, with only a few pieces of evidence in writing. The illness seemed to target young men and favor the wealthy or powerful. Court was dispersed to try and flatten the curve, but King Henry did not follow the COVID protocols. He had a theory that if he kept moving, he couldn't get sick. If the sweating sickness couldn't catch him, then he couldn't get the sweating sickness. And it couldn't catch him if he didn't stay in one place for too long. So he was on the move. And it seems like that worked for him. He didn't get sick. Anne had left for her self-imposed quarantine at her family home of Hever Castle. She did get sick. King Henry sent his personal physician to Hever Castle to take care of his mistress Anne. Well, his second best personal physician, because his best personal physician stayed with him. But Anne got his second best one. But not his previous mistress, Anne's sister Mary, whose husband, the king's friend, died in that very same outbreak. Anne recovered from her bout of sweating sickness. Henry then went back to work, trying to get his annulment. King Henry was still a Catholic. He wanted to get his annulment, if possible, from the Pope. Henry sent his secretary to the Pope, saying that the last Pope was lied to by his first wife, and they shouldn't have been given permission to marry. And please agree with him, because he's the king. But Henry's secretary couldn't get to the Pope, because Queen Catherine's nephew had sacked Rome and taken the Pope prisoner. So the Pope was siding with the Queen, because the Queen's nephew had him held captive. Henry would also have needed a papal dispensation to marry Anne, because he had been, until recently, been sleeping with her sister. So the whole argument was hypocritical. He wanted a divorce, claiming that his wife slept with his brother because they were married. Maybe they did. Probably they did. But he slept with her sister. Like, it's the exact same thing. You can share your thoughts with me at Long Live the Queen podcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can support me at buymeacoffee.com/longlivethequeen. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.